Regulatory Update 2, UK and Sweden. Moderated by Nick Nocton, Mishcon Reya, with David Zeffman, CMS, and Henrik Norsk Hoffmann, Nordic Gambling.
Hope we don't disappoint. Fortunately, I'm joined by two fantastic panelists to talk about the UK and Sweden. David Zeffman, who's the head of gambling and sport at CMS, and Henrik Hoffmann, who is a co-founder of Nordic Gambling. Obviously, there are enormous amounts of regulatory developments in the UK and Sweden in very recent times. We're not going to attempt to cover all of them. We will focus principally, at least initially, on affordability and data sharing and including the so-called single customer view. I'm going to start by asking you a question, Henrik. Is there a legal obligation in Sweden to conduct affordability checks?
Well, a clear obligation is not really to be seen in the legislation and the regulations. The administrative practice of the Swedish Gambling Authority suggests that there might be one, at least when it comes to AML. They've recently issued a guidance on AML that when you hit a certain threshold, at least the operator, I think that's 2,000 Swedish crowns, being about 200 euros spent, then at least the operator has some obligation to find out if that player can afford to spend that, and that's the practice at the moment. When it comes to responsible gambling, it's a different issue, both in Sweden, but for that matter also in Denmark. We see from the practice of the authorities when they are doing enforcement supervision that they actually expect the operators to do that. The Swedes are probably more hardcore than the Danes on this matter, because in Sweden, your taxable income is public record. And ultimately, the same goes for debt that has been left for public enforcement with bailiff courts. So the practice certainly suggests that the operators are expected to look into income and do a proper affordability check. In Denmark, there is no access to see what people earn and how much tax they paid last year. So the thresholds, at least before any operator is expected to look into income and affordability as such, is much higher, and it's a lot less clear. But even though there is no clear legislative obligation, it certainly seems from practice that both authorities actually think that there is some sort of an obligation to check affordability.
Okay, thanks, Henrik. David, in the UK, Great Britain, forgive me, I think we perceive a bit of a disconnect between what is technically required on affordability and what's actually happening in practice. There's a consultation exercise, and obviously the ongoing Gambling Act review may now cover also issues of affordability. Can you briefly summarize what's happening with it and how you expect it to pan out?
Okay, thanks, Nick, and hello, everybody. So almost exactly a year ago, as Nick just said, the Gambling Commission published a consultation on introducing affordability thresholds. And they only gave 10 weeks for responding, although that was extended by a few weeks. And the clear implication was that pretty much as soon as that consultation was over, the Gambling Commission would be introducing affordability thresholds. So really, the perspective that one got was that the consultation was just about where the affordability threshold would be set, not whether there should be any. And as to what the amount should be, in the consultation, it said somewhere between £100 and £2,000 a month of spend. But then a few days later, it published its latest enforcement report, and it was clear from that that really they were going to be talking about something much nearer £100 than £2,000. So what they said in that report was this: customers wishing to spend more than the national average should be asked to provide information to support a higher affordability trigger, such as 3 months pay slips, tax returns, bank statements, etc., etc. But actually, if you go on and read that report to see what the national average is, and obviously it varies, but it's somewhere between £100 and £500 a month. But that was disposable income, and the Gambling Commission said, but you've got to deduct from disposable income travel costs, petrol, phone bills, and so on. So we're talking about potentially a very low number. Then, as Nick said, the following month, so December last year, the government announced that they were going to be reviewing the whole of the gambling legislation. And there was a strong pushback from operators saying that the Gambling Commission shouldn't just on its own account introduce what would be a fundamental policy change by a change to the codes. And this really should be something for the government to decide. The Gambling Commission received 13,000 responses to the consultation, and I'm sure that's far more responses than they'd received to any other consultation. Then the Gambling Commission chief executive stepped down in March of this year, following the football index collapse, and he wasn't replaced by an interim chief executive until a couple of months ago. So then in May of this year, the Commission gave an update when they said they would be publishing a full response to the consultation this summer, and they would continue to work closely with the government on the review. So this summer came and went, nothing from the Commission. And then in September, I think it was, one of the Commission officials in a speech said that they would be publishing revised requirements on customer interaction in the coming weeks, which I think is a bit like a lawyer saying to his client, you'll get my advice shortly. It's a very elastic period of time. So look, I'm sure affordability thresholds will be introduced at some point, undoubtedly as part of the government's review. But I'm giving you a very long answer here, Nick, but I hope you don't mind. But actually, they're probably in place already. So we're seeing a lot of enforcement activity. And I think through that enforcement activity, the Commission has already de facto introduced affordability thresholds. And whereas a few years ago, most of the cases that the Commission was pursuing involved millions of pounds of losses, now we're seeing cases involving hundreds of thousands of pounds, or in some cases, tens of thousands. And there is nothing specific in any of the license codes practice that specify what the affordability threshold should be. But when you look at the LCCP, one of the things that you have to comply with, or you have to take into account, is Commission guidance. And then you have Commission guidance that refers to household data, customers' disposable income, and you end up with a position where you actually are obliged to know more about a customer and what they can afford to spend. That's probably the end of my answer.
It's interesting. I think you're right. Earlier on, when you highlighted that they mention ONS data and knowing what customers what their disposable income would be, but I mean that was in an enforcement report rather than guidance. So I think there is a genuine question around whether what is being enforced in compliance assessments is actually a correct interpretation. But there's no question that on what's happening on the ground is a very vigorous and quite bruising driving down of the levels at which of amounts of money that operators should permit people to gamble, and they are questioning why you don't have affordability evidence in cases where there are low thousands at most. Thank you, David. Henrik, in terms of what's happening in Sweden, there's been a very recent change. COVID emergency restrictions were released this weekend, I believe. Will they be replaced? Oh, sorry, I mean, briefly explain what they were, but does that mean it's open season in Sweden?
I seriously doubt
that. That's a joke question.
Having worked with the Swedish Gambling Authority for 3 years now, no, you're right. The emergency restrictions on deposits and bonus restrictions and so on due to COVID-19 were lifted with effect from yesterday. But we've seen a trend in the Swedish political environment and also in some of the enforcement cases from the SGA that they would really very much like to control how much money is allowed to be spent on gambling. The Swedish Gambling Authority has released a guidance recently for AML, though, where they suggest that on average, Swedish people spend 11% of their taxable income on leisure activities. So by that setting a threshold, if you hit 11% or more of your average Swedish income, then at least the operator should check for taxable income. That's far from an actual affordability check, because the capital gains taxes and so on are not necessarily included there. You can have wealth from other businesses, you can have debt, who knows. It's not as such an affordability check. But there are definitely trends in the political environment that gambling should be limited, and we're hearing some of the same voices in Denmark saying that we should control more and more. And that being said, in Denmark there's very little information available. We've had the equivalent to the Swedish duty of care, where you are supposed to monitor and profile your players from an RG point of view for only 2 years now. So all the enforcement cases we've seen are older than that, and it's all been AML. And where the Danes say, well, AML, you should have obtained this. It's regulated in the AML directive. It's in the AML Act in Denmark. You should have obtained this information on income because of the amount of play, and you should actually have applied that on responsible gambling, because you're supposed to collect this data, and we expect you to share this data with your RG team. On the contrary, in Sweden, we've seen another kind of strange guidance. The Swedish Gambling Authority stated something along the lines that they don't think they can enforce any sanctions against an operator that chose not to share affordability and income data from the AML department to the RG department, even within the same organization. So
because of GDPR constraints.
That's their concern, that the GDPR, because income related to responsible gambling, they think needs to be classified as health information, and that is a different category of sensitivity.
Notwithstanding that it's within the same data controller, etc. So you would question that interpretation?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's within the same organization. Ultimately, if there isn't a clear legal obligation to collect this data and to process this to see if people are spending more money on gambling than they can afford, then it's for me a matter of a simple provision in the privacy policy that you collect as part of the consent the right to use the data in this way. It's a bit strange for me that you have AML legislation that suggests that you need to collect this data and you need to share it across all entities in a group of companies. And then when it comes to responsible gambling, which ultimately is one of the main reasons why both Denmark and Sweden decided to open their markets for private operators, was to get more control to protect the players. And yet they say, I don't think we can enforce that you use the data available. That sounds a bit strange to me, and then it doesn't sound to me as if they checked it with the authorities for data protection.
I would agree. David, similar issues arise in relation to what's called the single customer view in the UK. There's been some recent developments there. Can you just briefly outline what those are and what you think those issues are?
Sure. So, I mean, just to explain what single customer view is, or certainly what the Gambling Commission sees it as, it's a holistic view of a customer's online gambling behavior to help reduce gambling harms. So what the Gambling Commission said is this cross-operator view of a customer's gambling activities could help identify and prevent potential gambling harms in those who hold accounts with more than one gambling company. Now, at first blush, it's a laudable objective. If your aim is to protect gamblers from themselves, then you really need to understand all of their gambling activity. Otherwise, if one operator restricts their activity or closes them down, then they're just going to go to other operators. However, putting aside the not inconsiderable technical challenges, it raises a whole range of legal issues. Data protection, obviously, but also privacy rights, competition law, human rights, consumer law, just to name some. So the first of those, data protection, was addressed by the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the data protection regulator in the UK. And they published their preliminary views last month. They have this thing called a regulatory sandbox, where you can sort of play around with ideas, and the Gambling Commission's idea of having a single customer view was something that the ICO considered. Now, from the Gambling Commission's perspective, what the ICO said made it all seem very straightforward. So the Gambling Commission Chief Executive, once the ICO had published its views, said, well, we know it's technically possible. The ICO has published on how it can be done safely, protecting people's data. It's now for the industry to trial a solution. So I think he must have been reading it at a distance and not reading the words that he didn't want to see, because actually the ICO's advice was littered with caveats. In particular, the ICO cautioned that for the purposes of the sandbox, a conceptual model of a single customer view was considered, and that its conclusions could be subject to change due to factors such as the technical specification, the architecture, or the construction of the solution. And they also stressed that analysis would be required to ensure that the processing of data was necessary and proportionate. And I think proportionality is actually a big issue here, not just in relation to data protection. I mean, in the UK, problem gambling rates are coming down, and we're already low by international standards. So is this system where every person's gambling, a leisure activity, will be collated in a central register and shared among competitors, let alone the no doubt huge technical expenditure, is it really justified? And also, coming back to the conversation we just had about affordability, there must be a huge danger of a slippery slope. So once you've got some activity being collated centrally, what time of day was someone playing, how long were they playing for? Well, it's not a big step to say, well, we should have the income information on there so that that's accessible by all operators. So I think, in my personal view, is actually this is a sledgehammer, a very big sledgehammer, to crack a nut which is, shrinking.
Okay, thank you. We've got very limited time left, so I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, David, one more question. And it relates to the new chair and CEO of the Gambling Commission. We've obviously got new management there. Do you think that heralds a change of approach? What can the industry expect?
I don't know. I'm probably a bit cynical about it, to be honest. Maybe that's just a function of being a lawyer. But I think that the trouble is that the Gambling Commission has been the subject of such heavy criticism by parliamentarians, the media, that they're sort of by default erring on the side of being more and more aggressive in their interventions and in their enforcement action. Because if they go too far, well, they're not going to be criticised by the politicians and the anti-gambling campaigners. And okay, the operators won't like it, but that's not their concern. Now, Steve Ketley from Wigan often makes the point that actually, as a regulator, they have an obligation to promote the industry they regulate. But that's not something you ever really see from the Gambling Commission. Now, the current interim chief executive has recently come out with fine words about collaboration. Neil MacArthur used to talk about that a lot as well, but...
only once we've got it right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, look, I regret to say we have run out of time. There is so much that we could have covered, but thank you very much to Henrik and to David, and I look forward to the rest of the afternoon with you. Thank you.